The year was 1943. High above Europe, the skies had become a deadly chessboard. The Luftwaffe ruled with confidence, their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dominating Allied bombers that dared to cross into German airspace. Every mission meant gambling with life, and too often the odds were grim. Then came a new American fighter, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. When it first appeared on the tarmac, pilots didn't cheer, they laughed. Even the Germans, watching through reconnaissance photos, couldn't take it seriously. The Thunderbolt looked enormous, bulky, heavy, almost comical next to the sleek, razor-nosed fighters of the time. They called it the flying milk bottle, a beast too large for dogfights, too slow for chases, and too heavy to survive. To many, it seemed like another bureaucratic blunder, an engineer's fantasy forced onto pilots who'd rather trust the lighter Spitfires or the elegant P-51 Mustangs. Even among American squadrons, skepticism was rampant. Pilots joked that if you ran out of ammo, you could just throw the airplane at the enemy. Mechanics groaned at its complex engine, while commanders questioned whether it could even climb fast enough to reach bomber altitude. But behind that laughter was something no one yet understood: raw, unpolished power. The P-47 wasn't built for elegance, it was built for survival. Beneath its stubby frame sat a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a mechanical giant capable of over 2,000 horsepower. Its massive frame wasn't a flaw, it was armor. Its wings didn't glide, they endured. Still, in those early days, perception ruled over performance. The Luftwaffe pilots smirked. The Americans doubted, and the Thunderbolt sat on the airfields, waiting for a chance to prove what brute strength could do in a world obsessed with beauty and speed. What they didn't realize was that this flying milk bottle would soon become their worst nightmare, a war machine that could shrug off cannon fire, dive faster than anything in the sky, and spit out a storm of 50 caliber rounds that would shred steel and courage alike. The laughter was loud in 1943, but in the months to come, the skies would fall silent. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt didn't begin in the sky. It began on the drafting tables of Republic Aviation, inside a modest factory in Farmingdale, Long Island. It was 1940, and the world was already burning. Europe lay under the iron fist of Nazi air power, and the United States, though not yet in the war, could see the storm on the horizon. At the heart of this story was a man named Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer who had fled war-torn Europe to design aircraft in America. Kartveli had one guiding belief: that future air battles wouldn't be won by fragile, lightweight planes, but by machines that could take punishment and strike back harder. His vision went against nearly every convention of the time. While most designers were obsessed with sleek frames and minimal weight, Kartveli proposed something outrageous: a fighter so large it could carry a massive engine, heavy armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and enough ammunition to sustain long fights deep over enemy territory. When he presented the concept to the Army Air Corps, many eyebrows rose. Some called it impractical, others insane, but the idea stuck. America needed something that could escort bombers to the heart of Germany, a fighter that could endure brutal punishment and still bring its pilot home. And so, the XP-47B prototype was born. Its design revolved around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an engineering masterpiece. 18 cylinders of raw thunder, capable of pushing the aircraft past 400 miles per hour. Behind it, a complex turbo supercharger system filled the fuselage, giving the P-47 unmatched performance at high altitudes. Yet with that power came weight. Nearly 8 tons fully loaded, an absurd figure for a single-seat fighter. The P-47 was heavier than some light bombers. Early test flights confirmed both its promise and its flaws. It was fast, yes, but it drank fuel like a monster, and it handled sluggishly on takeoff and landing. Still, there was something there, something brutal, untamed, but full of potential. Test pilots began to notice how stable it was at high speeds, how it refused to break apart in steep dives where other fighters would lose control. And when they fired those 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, the sound was like rolling thunder. Each wing carried 4 of these guns, capable of firing nearly 100 rounds per second combined. It wasn't just firepower, it was dominance. One pass from a Thunderbolt could turn a German convoy into smoking wreckage, but in the beginning few believed it would ever reach combat. The factory workers nicknamed it the Jug, short for Juggernaut. It was meant as a joke, but it fit perfectly, because that's exactly what the P-47 would become, an unstoppable force. As America entered the war, production ramped up. Hundreds, then thousands rolled off the assembly lines. They were assigned to the 8th Air Force, stationed in England, ready to face the full power of the Luftwaffe. Pilots who once mocked its size now climbed into the cockpit with a sense of awe. The visibility was wide, the controls solid, and when that engine roared to life, the entire airfield seemed to tremble. Still, doubt lingered. Would this overweight brute survive against the sleek and deadly Messerschmitt Bf-109s or Focke-Wulf 190s? No one knew for sure. But those who had flown it sensed something different, a strange growing confidence. The Thunderbolt was not built to dance in the air. It was built to dominate it. And soon it would prove that in war, power and endurance could be deadlier than grace. The flying milk bottle had been born, forged not in elegance, but in purpose. And as it prepared to meet the enemy, the skies over Europe were about to witness the rise of a legend. When the first P-47 squadrons arrived in England in early 1943, they didn't make much of an impression. On the crowded airfields of East Anglia, surrounded by elegant Spitfires and agile Mustangs, the Thunderbolt looked like an intruder, a fat, lumbering outsider among sleek predators. Even the pilots assigned to fly it weren't sure what to make of it. Many of them had come from lighter, more maneuverable aircraft. They looked at the massive fuselage, the thick wings and the towering propeller, and wondered if the engineers back home had lost their minds. The British were blunt about it. One RAF officer reportedly smirked and said, "It's not a fighter, it's a flying tank." The comment spread quickly among Allied bases, and so did the jokes. "If the Germans don't shoot you down," pilots would laugh, "the weight will pull you out of the sky." Even within the American ranks, doubt ran deep. The P-47's massive engine made it a nightmare to service, and its complex turbocharger system baffled mechanics. Fuel consumption was outrageous, limiting its early missions to short-range sorties. Pilots often returned to base barely having reached enemy airspace, and in those early missions, performance comparisons didn't help. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were lighter, more agile, and already proven in battle. The German pilots, veterans of years of air combat, were supremely confident. When they first encountered the new American fighter, they mocked it openly. Reports from downed Allied pilots reached intelligence officers, describing how German aces joked about the fat one, the new cow in the sky. Some even refused to engage, calling it a waste of ammunition, and to a degree they were right at first. The Thunderbolt's early missions were plagued with problems. Its climb rate was poor, and its massive frame struggled to match the nimble German fighters in tight dogfights. Inexperienced pilots tried to fight on the enemy's terms, turning, looping, dancing, and paid the price. Several early encounters ended badly, reinforcing the Thunderbolt's reputation as a heavy disappointment. Back home, newspapers and airmen whispered that it was too big to fight. Commanders debated whether to replace it entirely with lighter aircraft, but the truth was the P-47 wasn't being used the way it was meant to be. It wasn't a duelist's plane. It wasn't built to outturn or outspin anyone. Its true strength was something the pilots had yet to discover, something hidden behind that thick metal skin and roaring engine. While German pilots laughed, American engineers were working day and night to tweak the design. They refined the supercharger, increased range with drop tanks, and trained pilots to use its strengths: speed in a dive, devastating firepower, and near invulnerability. In the briefing rooms, flight instructors began to change their tone. "Don't turn with them," they warned. "Dive, hit hard, get out. The Jug can take what they can't." The pilots listened, some skeptically, some with curiosity. And slowly, as the missions continued, they started to feel something different when flying the Thunderbolt. They noticed how it didn't shudder in dives that tore other fighters apart, how its armor could shrug off cannon shells that would shred anything else in the sky. Yes, it was heavy. Yes, it was clumsy on the runway. But once airborne at high altitude and in a full dive, it was unstoppable. The Germans still laughed, of course. But laughter has a way of fading when reality begins to shift, and soon the skies over Europe would no longer echo with jokes about the flying milk bottle. They would roar with thunder. War is the ultimate test of design, where theory meets fire and beauty means nothing if it can't survive the storm. And the P-47 Thunderbolt, for all its size and skepticism, was about to prove that strength could be its own form of elegance. At the core of the Thunderbolt's success was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, one of the most advanced radial engines of its era. 18 cylinders, twin-rows, air-cooled, and capable of generating over 2,300 horsepower, it was a machine that could turn raw fuel into pure fury. Most fighters of the time relied on liquid-cooled inline engines, powerful but fragile. One bullet through a radiator, and the aircraft became a glider. The R2800 was different. Air-cooled and armor-plated, it could take hits and keep spinning. That single decision, to build around this engine, gave the Thunderbolt a soul of iron. But the engine alone wasn't what made the aircraft revolutionary. The real magic lay in how the Republic engineers used it. Kartveli and his team designed an ingenious turbo supercharger system mounted behind the cockpit. It fed compressed air into the massive engine, allowing it to maintain full power at altitudes above 30,000 feet, higher than most enemy fighters could reach. This design meant the Thunderbolt wasn't just a brawler, it was a climber, a high-altitude guardian. Its bulk, once mocked, became an advantage. The large fuselage could house the supercharger, heavy armor, and over 3,000 rounds of ammunition. The thick wings carried 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 on each side. When fired together, they unleashed a wall of lead, nearly 100 rounds per second, enough to tear through bombers, fighters, trains, and even tanks. It was, quite literally, a flying arsenal. Then there was its armor. The cockpit was wrapped in steel plating, the fuel tanks were self-sealing, and even the control cables were shielded to prevent a single bullet from grounding the plane. Pilots soon realized something extraordinary. This aircraft could take damage that would destroy any other fighter, and still fly home. There are countless reports from the European front of P-47s limping back to base, wings riddled with holes, engines smoking, landing gear half-functional and yet still alive. One pilot described the feeling perfectly. It wasn't just an airplane, it was a tank with wings. This rugged design changed everything about how it was used in battle. Where lighter fighters had to flee after a single pass, the Thunderbolt could stay in the fight. It could dive steeply, fire and climb out over and over again, surviving hits that would have sent other planes into flames. Its diving ability was legendary. With its weight and streamlined control surfaces, the P-47 could dive faster than any other fighter of its time, sometimes exceeding 500 miles per hour. German pilots quickly learned a terrifying truth. Once a Thunderbolt began a dive, there was no catching it. That advantage reshaped pilot tactics. Instead of dogfighting on equal terms, they began to use boom and zoom attacks, diving from above, unleashing a storm of fire, and pulling back up before the enemy could react. It was hit-and-run warfare in the sky, devastating, precise, and brutally effective. The very things that had made the P-47 a joke, its weight, its armor, its engine size, now became the source of its invincibility. It was not the elegant duelist that designers of the era worshipped. It was the hammer that broke the Luftwaffe's sword. And while the Germans kept improving their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, they faced a problem they hadn't encountered before, an enemy that simply refused to die. As one Luftwaffe pilot later admitted, "We would hit it, and hit it again, and still it came back. It was like fighting a thunderstorm." By mid-1943, that storm was growing. American pilots were learning how to unleash the beast beneath them. The P-47 was no longer a flying joke. It was becoming a weapon of legend, the perfect fusion of brute power, endurance, and overwhelming fire. It wasn't beautiful. It didn't need to be, because beauty doesn't win wars. Survival does, and in that, the Thunderbolt stood unmatched. By early 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had left the factory floor and entered the crucible of war. Its massive engine roared to life across airfields in England, where the 56th Fighter Group prepared for its first missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. But not everyone was convinced. Even among American pilots, the Thunderbolt was still something of a mystery, enormous, heavy, and unlike any fighter they had ever flown. Many had cut their teeth in nimble aircraft like the Spitfire or the P-40. Compared to them, the P-47 felt like a flying fortress. Its takeoff roll was long, its climb rate sluggish, and its cockpit visibility limited by the huge engine cowling. The ground crews joked that the only way to make a Thunderbolt airborne was to push it off a cliff, but those same pilots were about to discover what that clumsy giant could do once unleashed. The first combat missions came in April 1943, escorting Allied bombers over France. The Luftwaffe still dominated the skies there, with experienced aces flying the fearsome Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. German pilots had grown arrogant. They had seen enemy planes come and go, and they expected this new American brute to be no different, just another fat target. They were wrong. The first major engagement occurred on April 15, 1943. Captain Bob Johnson and his squadron climbed to intercept enemy fighters, closing in on a formation of B-17 bombers. At 30,000 feet, the air was thin, the temperatures freezing, conditions that sapped most engines of power, but not the Thunderbolt. Its turbo supercharger kept the R-2800 roaring as if it was still at sea level. Out of the glare, the Germans dove in. Sleek 190s slashed through the formation, confident and fast. Johnson pushed the throttle forward and felt the machine come alive. The acceleration was monstrous. The Thunderbolt didn't dance. It charged. He rolled in behind a 190, squeezed the trigger, and 850 caliber guns thundered in unison. The sky erupted in flashes, a storm of lead that ripped through the enemy's fuselage. The German aircraft disintegrated mid-air, and the rest scattered. It was the beginning of a shift in air warfare. Word spread quickly among Allied squadrons. The Thunderbolt could not only take punishment, it could deliver it. In the following months, missions deep into occupied Europe became increasingly dangerous. Luftwaffe interceptors swarmed Allied bombers daily, and the P-47's job was to meet them head-on. Still, not every battle went smoothly. Early on, the Thunderbolt's limited range was a serious handicap. It could only escort bombers part of the way before turning back. Once it left, the bombers were sitting ducks. Engineers later solved this by fitting drop tanks under the wings, extending its range far enough to reach Berlin. But in 1943, those improvements were still months away. That meant that every sortie was a gamble, and survival depended on skill, coordination, and sheer luck. The defining moment for the P-47 came with Captain Bob Johnson's legendary encounter in the summer of 1943. During a dogfight over France, Johnson's Thunderbolt was ambushed by a German ace. Cannon shells tore through the fuselage, the canopy shattered, the control cables frayed, and the cockpit filled with smoke. Yet the engine kept running. Johnson tried to bail out, but the canopy jammed. He was trapped. With no choice, he leveled the aircraft and prepared to die fighting. The German fighter circled back, riddling the P-47 with round after round, but the Thunderbolt refused to fall. Its armor absorbed hit after hit. Johnson's guns jammed, leaving him defenseless. Yet somehow the plane stayed in the air. When the German pilot finally broke off, running out of ammunition, Johnson limped home across the channel. His aircraft shot to pieces, riddled with over 200 bullet holes. Mechanics who inspected it afterward were stunned. The engine had been shredded, the tail nearly severed, and yet it had flown. From that day, no one doubted the Thunderbolt's reputation. It was officially nicknamed the Jug, short for Juggernaut, a perfect name for an aircraft that refused to quit. Soon, the Luftwaffe's laughter turned to silence. German pilots learned to recognize the Thunderbolt's silhouette from miles away, and many chose not to engage. They had seen too many of their comrades vanish under its guns. By late 1943, the 56th, 78th, and 4th Fighter Groups were rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. Instead of merely escorting bombers, they began taking the fight directly to the enemy, attacking airfields, rail lines, and supply convoys across occupied Europe. This shift in tactics made the Thunderbolt indispensable. Its durability allowed it to dive into flak-filled skies, destroy targets, and climb back out without being torn apart. Pilots loved it because it gave them something priceless, a fighting chance to come home. As one veteran put it, you could take a Thunderbolt into hell and it would bring you back. The Germans never truly recovered from the psychological impact. The once arrogant Luftwaffe, confident in its agile machines and ace pilots, now faced an opponent that outlasted, outclimbed, and outgunned them, and with every sortie, the legend of the Thunderbolt grew. By the end of 1943, the laughter that had once greeted the P-47 had faded completely. What began as a misunderstood beast was now the hammer of the skies. A weapon forged not in beauty but in brutal efficiency. The Allies had found their champion. And the war in the air would never be the same again. By 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer just a fighter. It was the embodiment of Allied air power. What began as an overweight experiment had evolved into the Luftwaffe's worst nightmare. From the frozen skies over France to the smoking fields of Germany, the roar of the R-2800 engine became a sound that sent German soldiers scrambling for cover. But this transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the result of constant innovation, brutal experience, and the unbreakable will of the men who flew it. After the hard lessons of 1943, the US Army Air Forces pushed engineers to solve the Thunderbolt's greatest weakness, its limited range. Without long-range escorts, American bombers suffered catastrophic losses deep inside enemy territory. Missions over Berlin, Hamburg, and the Ruhr Valley turned into slaughter. The Thunderbolt could protect them only part of the way. The solution came in the form of drop tanks, external fuel containers that could be jettisoned once empty. With these attached, the P-47's range more than doubled, allowing it to escort bombers all the way to the heart of the Reich and back. This changed everything. Now, the bombers weren't alone. And when the Luftwaffe rose to intercept them, the Thunderbolts were waiting. High above, engines humming, guns ready. The skies of Europe turned into a deadly chessboard. Every sortie became a calculated battle of altitude, timing, and firepower. The Luftwaffe still fielded its elite pilots, men like Adolf, Galland and Johannes Steinhoff, but they were now facing a relentless new enemy that wouldn't back down. The Thunderbolt's boom and zoom tactics dominated the air war. Pilots would climb high, dive at tremendous speed, fire their 850s in a devastating burst, and then climb back before the enemy could retaliate. It was hit-and-run warfare perfected, using speed and altitude as weapons. German fighters like the Bf-109 and FW-190, which once ruled the skies, found themselves outmatched. They could turn faster, yes, but they couldn't absorb damage, couldn't climb as high, and couldn't escape once the Thunderbolt locked onto them. One German pilot later confessed, "The Thunderbolt was not a fighter we could outfly. It was a machine we survived, if we were lucky." Meanwhile, Allied pilots learned to trust their aircraft completely. They began flying lower, taking on ground targets with the same ferocity they had shown in dogfights, railroads, convoys, tanks, and even troop formations. Nothing was safe. The P-47 could carry bombs, rockets, and drop tanks, transforming it into one of the first true multi-role fighters. It became the hammer of the Allied advance, clearing the way for armies moving across Europe. Every mission deepened its legend. A single Thunderbolt could destroy an entire supply train in one pass, leaving trails of fire stretching for miles. Its 850s ripped through armored vehicles like paper. When equipped with 500-pound bombs or HVAR rockets, it could level bridges and artillery positions with terrifying precision. Pilots began calling it the Flying Juggernaut, and the name fit perfectly. Unstoppable, unyielding, and merciless. But perhaps the greatest proof of the Thunderbolt's power came during Operation Overlord, D-Day, June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history. As Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the sky thundered with the sound of thousands of aircraft. Among them were the P-47s, leading the charge. Their job was simple yet vital, to destroy anything that could threaten the landings. They dove through anti-aircraft fire, strafing German bunkers, cutting down reinforcements and silencing artillery. Pilots flew mission after mission, sometimes 10 sorties a day, returning only long enough to refuel and rearm. The German defenders never stood a chance. Every road, every bridge, every convoy that tried to move toward the beaches was torn apart by the thunderbolts overhead. Soldiers on the ground came to rely on that distinct roar. It was the sound of salvation. As one Allied infantryman later said, "When the jugs came in low, you felt invincible. You knew someone up there was watching over you." By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was breaking. Its once fearsome squadrons were being decimated faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages, lack of training, and the overwhelming presence of Allied fighters made survival nearly impossible. The Thunderbolt had become the backbone of the Allied air offensive. Its kill-to-loss ratio was astonishing, and unlike other fighters, it was as feared by ground troops as it was by enemy pilots. It could fly through flak that shredded lighter aircraft, return with engines half destroyed, and still land safely. Its pilots began to boast, not out of arrogance, but out of awe, that the Thunderbolt was the only plane that could win a war by itself. Even General Dwight D. Eisenhower credited the P-47 as one of the key weapons that made D-Day possible. Without air superiority, the beaches would have been death traps. But with the Thunderbolts ruling the skies, the invasion succeeded. Still, what truly cemented its legacy wasn't just its performance in battle, it was its reliability. In war, technology often breaks down. Engines fail, systems malfunction, but the P-47 didn't quit. It kept flying. It kept fighting. It brought its pilots home, and those pilots became legends. Men like Francis Gabby Gabreski, Hub Zemke, and Robert S. Johnson, who racked up dozens of victories each. They weren't just fighting machines. They were symbols of resilience, courage, and American ingenuity. By the time the Allies pushed into Germany, the Thunderbolt had earned the respect of friend and foe alike. Luftwaffe survivors would later admit that they dreaded the moment they saw a formation of P-47s diving toward them. "So we could run from the Mustangs," one German pilot recalled. But from the Thunderbolts, there was no running. They owned the sky. From ridicule to reverence, the transformation was complete. What had started as a design mocked for its size had become the war's most feared and reliable aircraft. The laughter that once echoed through Luftwaffe bases had been replaced by silence, and the low, distant rumble of the R-2800, growing louder with every mission. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter. It was a declaration that brute strength, endurance, and willpower could triumph over arrogance and elegance. That in the chaos of war, it's not the most graceful machine that wins, but the one that refuses to fall. And in that, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood alone. By 1945, the war that had once seemed endless was drawing to a close. Across Europe, the ruins of cities stood as silent witnesses to years of destruction. The skies, once filled with fire and smoke, now belonged to the victors, and among those victors was a machine that had become a legend, the P-47 Thunderbolt. From the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, the Thunderbolt had proven itself not through elegance or speed, but through sheer endurance and devastating power. It wasn't the most graceful fighter of World War II. It didn't have the sleek beauty of the Spitfire or the romantic mystique of the Mustang, but it had something none of them could match: unbreakable reliability. By the end of the conflict, P-47s had flown more than 746,000 sorties, dropped over 130,000 tons of bombs, and destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft, tanks, and trains. Its kill-to-loss ratio stood among the best of any Allied fighter, a testament not only to its design but to the courage of the men who flew it. Pilots who had once doubted the Jug came to worship it. They told stories of limping home with half a wing missing, engines torn open by flak, and controls shredded, yet still landing safely. For many, the Thunderbolt wasn't just a machine. It was a guardian angel made of metal and fire. As one veteran recalled, "You didn't just fly a Jug, you trusted it with your life, and it never let you down." When peace finally came, the Thunderbolt didn't fade into history quietly. It continued to serve across the globe, in Europe, the Pacific, and later in Korea and Latin America. Nations that once watched it with awe now sought to buy it, study it, and build their own versions. It had become a symbol, a testament to what happens when practicality triumphs over pride. In a war defined by innovation, the P-47 stood as proof that the simplest ideas, strength, reliability, firepower, could be the most powerful. Even the Luftwaffe, in defeat acknowledged its greatness. Captured German pilots admitted that facing the Thunderbolt was one of the most terrifying experiences of the war. It wasn't just its firepower, it was the way it refused to die. "I could shoot at it all day," one German ace said, "and it would still be there when the sun went down." The P-47's design philosophy went on to influence generations of aircraft that followed. Its rugged build and modular structure inspired the engineering of later ground attack planes like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a direct spiritual successor built on the same principles: survivability, power, and unstoppable fire. It's no coincidence that the A-10 inherited its ancestor's nickname, the Warthog. Like the original Jug, it was mocked for its size, its shape, and its lack of grace. And just like the P-47, it silenced all critics the moment it entered battle. In that way, the legacy of the Thunderbolt lives on, not just in museums or photographs, but in every aircraft designed with endurance and strength in mind. It reminds us of a timeless truth about war and about life itself, that victory doesn't always belong to the fastest or the prettiest, but to those who can take a hit, keep moving, and come back stronger. The Germans once laughed at the P-47, but by the end, no one was laughing, because when its 850 caliber guns began to roar, the sky itself trembled, and the laughter turned into silence. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, and peace returned to the skies of Europe, the world began to take stock of what had been lost and what had been won. Among the ruins of cities and the wreckage of war machines, one aircraft stood as a symbol of endurance and victory: the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It had entered the war as an underdog, mocked for its size, doubted by its own pilots, and dismissed by its enemies. But it ended the war as one of the most feared, respected, and successful fighters ever built. It didn't win hearts with beauty or grace. It won respect through brutal reliability, raw power, and unshakable strength. Across air bases in England and France, Thunderbolts sat battered but unbroken, their wings scorched, their fuselages punctured by flak, yet still standing. Mechanics walked among them in silence, aware that these machines had carried countless men home who should never have survived. For many pilots, saying goodbye to their Jugs was emotional. They had trusted these aircraft with everything, through dogfights, storm clouds, and walls of enemy fire. Some gave their planes nicknames: Lucky Lady, Spirit of Atlantic City, Bonnie Lee. Each one carried not just paint and insignias, but memories of comrades lost and missions survived. "It wasn't just an airplane," one pilot said quietly. "It was a friend who never quit on you." As the world moved into the jet age, the Thunderbolt's roar began to fade from the skies. Faster and sleeker aircraft took its place. Yet even as technology marched forward, veterans and historians alike continued to speak of the Jug with reverence. Because the P-47 had done something extraordinary, it had turned ridicule into reverence. Its success wasn't just in the number of missions flown or enemies destroyed, but in the way it embodied a spirit that defined the Allied war effort: resilience, adaptability, and unwavering will. It proved that perfection in war isn't found in elegance, but in endurance. In time, the Thunderbolt became more than a weapon. It became a lesson in design and determination. Its influence can be traced through decades of aviation, from the Vietnam-era strike jets to the modern A-10 Thunderbolt II, whose very name honors its World War II predecessor. Every time the A-10 fires its GAU-8 cannon, unleashing thunder from the sky, it carries forward the soul of the original Jug, that unstoppable force that once roared over Europe, shielding soldiers below and punishing enemies who thought they were untouchable. Today, a handful of Thunderbolts still fly. At air shows, they rise from the tarmac with that same deep, throaty roar, a sound that once shook the heavens. Crowds look up in awe, and for a brief moment, time folds in on itself. The modern world fades, and you can almost imagine the smoke, the chaos, and the courage of those long-ago missions. And in that sound, that thunder rolling across the open sky, there's something eternal. A reminder that even when mocked, even when underestimated, true strength always finds its moment to rise. The German pilots laughed at the Thunderbolt once. They saw only a heavy, clumsy machine, a target, not a threat. But when its 850 caliber guns roared to life, raining fire across the sky, that laughter was silenced forever. because the Jug wasn't built to impress. It was built to survive, and in doing so it became immortal, even now. 8 decades later, when one lifts off the runway and disappears into the clouds, it carries with it the echo of a single truth, that in every age, there will always be those who underestimate strength. Until it's too late. The Thunderbolt was never supposed to be a legend, but legends like thunder don't ask for permission. They're heard, they're feared, and they never fade.